This country faces an unprecedented crisis in terms of the pandemic and the economic meltdown. I understand that negotiations are currently going on in terms of coming up with an economic package dealing with COVID-19 relief. And I applaud the very hard work that each of the negotiators are doing, Democrats and Republicans. But the truth of the matter is that the results up to this point of those negotiations are totally unsatisfactory, given the economic desperation facing tens of millions of working families all across this country. As I think everyone will remember, back in March of this year, at the beginning of the pandemic, the United States Congress acted unanimously, Democrats and Republicans worked with President Trump to come up with an economic package that went a long way toward preventing absolute misery and destitution for many of our people. Through no fault of their own, COVID-19 resulted in millions of our people losing their jobs and their income. That's what the pandemic did. Nobody is to blame. That's what happened. And in response, in March, Democrats and Republicans in this Congress came together, worked with the President of the United States, and in a very significant way responded to that crisis. That is what we did in March. Madam President, what I don't understand is that at a time when in many ways the economic and public health crisis is worse today than it was in March, I don't understand why we are not responding accordingly. In March, as you know, we passed the $2.2 trillion CARES Act, which included a $600 supplement to unemployed workers. And my God, what relief that was to millions of workers who had lost their jobs. And in addition, we provided a $1,200 direct payment for every working class adult in this country, plus $500 for their kids. Once again, and let me repeat this, once again, we did this unanimously, and we did it working with President Trump despite many of the enormous disagreements that a lot of us have with President Trump on so many issues. Now, what I don't understand is if we could work together in March, if we could have succeeded 9 months ago, why can we not do exactly the same thing right now? And that is why I will insist that any agreement in terms of a COVID-19 relief package must include not only strong unemployment benefits, but a $1,200 direct payment for the working families of this country, similarly structured to what was included in the CARES package of March. And I will be introducing an amendment to the 1-week continuing resolution to make sure that that occurs, that every working class adult in this country receives another $1,200 direct payment plus $500 for their kids. If we could do it in March, and it was the right thing then, now, at a time when the situation in many ways is even worse, we can and must do it today. Madam President, every member of this body, I know, wants to get out of Washington to get home to their families for the holiday season, and put me at the very top of that list. But at a time when so many American families are suffering, when so many people don't know how they're going to feed their kids or prevent being evicted from their homes, or how they're going to pay for a doctor's visit, we cannot leave Washington and return to our families unless we address the economic suffering that so many other families are facing. When a national emergency occurs, the United States government must respond. And we are in a national emergency today. To get out of Washington, to turn our backs on the suffering of so many men, women, and children in Vermont and in every other state in this country would be immoral, it would be unconscionable, and we cannot allow that to happen. Again, we must make certain that every working family in this country receives a $1,200 direct payment plus $500 for their kids. That is the least that we can do. Madam President, let me be as clear as I can be. Today, as a result of the horrific pandemic and economic meltdown, the American working class is hurting in a way that has not been experienced since the Great Depression of the 1930s. In terms of public health, yesterday alone, over 220,000 Americans were diagnosed with COVID-19 yesterday. And tragically, over 3,000 died from this horrific virus. We are experiencing now some of the worst days in terms of cases being diagnosed, in terms of hospitalization, in terms of death. That is where we are today. In other words, more Americans were killed by the coronavirus yesterday than were killed on 9/11. Madam President, tens of millions of our fellow citizens have lost their jobs as a result of the pandemic. They have lost their incomes. They have lost their health insurance. They have depleted their life savings. And let me tell you this, we deferred evictions. We prevented people from becoming evicted from their homes. But when at some point that deferment ends, all across this country, people are going to be owing thousands and thousands of dollars to their landlords. They don't have the money to pay that. And tens of millions of people are in danger of being evicted. Madam President, you may have noticed that there were reports out there that hunger, this is the United States of America, the wealthiest country in the history of the world, we're looking at numbers which suggest that hunger is at the highest level that we have seen in decades. Children in America are going hungry. And all across this country, tenants are worried that they're going to knock on the door from the sheriff, evicting them from their homes or their apartments and throwing their belongings out on the street to join the other 500,000 Americans who are now homeless. In America today, Over half of our workers are living paycheck to paycheck. Well, 1 out of every 4 workers in this country are either unemployed or earning an annual income of less than $20,000 a year. And I don't know how anybody makes it on less than $20,000 a year. During the holiday season to come, over 1/3 of Americans expect to lose income and all already having a difficult time paying for their basic household expenses. Madam President, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that at a time when so many people in our economy are suffering, it has been far worse for the African American and Latino communities. During this pandemic, nearly 60% of Latino families and 55% of African American families have either experienced a job loss or a pay cut. That is just an unimaginable number. So the general population suffering, even worse for the African American and Latino communities. Madam President, I should also add that in the midst of this pandemic, not everybody is suffering. The people on top, at least some of the billionaires on top, are doing phenomenally well. Over the past 9 months of this pandemic, 650 billionaires, 650, not a whole lot of people, have seen their wealth go up by over $1 trillion during this pandemic, and now own over twice as much wealth as the bottom 50% of American people. Madam President, this is the United States of America, the richest country in the history of the world. No person in this great country should be going hungry. No person should live in fear of going homeless. No person in America should lack the health care that they need when they or their kids get sick, especially in the midst of the worst public health crisis in 100 years. Can you imagine? I mean, it really is unimaginable that when we're looking at 220,000 people yesterday being diagnosed with COVID-19, with the virus, and you got 90 million people in America who are either uninsured or underinsured. They can't even afford to go to a doctor. But that is exactly what is going on in America today. Madam President, this is an unprecedented moment in American history, and the Senate needs to take unprecedented action to protect the working families of this country who are facing extreme economic desperation. If we could act effectively in March through the CARES Act, we can act effectively today as we enter this holiday season. Once again, I very much appreciate the hard work that has gone into the current $908 billion proposal being worked on by a number of Democratic and Republican senators. But simply stated, given the horrific extent of the current crisis and the desperation of so many of our people, this proposal does not go anywhere far enough. In truth, rather than the $3.4 trillion, which we on the Democratic side called for in the HEROES Act and passed in the House, the U.S. House of Representatives a number of months ago passed a $3.4 trillion bill. But what is being discussed and negotiated right now with Democratic and Republican senators only allocates $348 billion in new money. The remaining $560 billion of funds transferred from the CARES Act that have not yet been obligated. So what we're talking about now, as opposed to $3.4 trillion passed in the HEROES Act, is roughly speaking $348 billion in new money right now. We're talking about, roughly speaking, 10% of new money compared to what was passed in the House. That is absurd. That is unacceptable. I am prepared to negotiate, but I cannot negotiate in good faith when we are receiving 10% of new money compared to what was passed in the House in the HEROES bill. Unlike the CARES Act, which we passed unanimously in March, the proposal now being negotiated only provides a $300 supplement for unemployed workers rather than $600 a week. Further, unlike the $1,200 direct payment for every working class individual and $500 for each child, this agreement being negotiated provides absolutely nothing, zero. Moreover, this proposal does nothing to address the healthcare crisis impacting tens of millions of Americans who cannot afford medical care and has totally inadequate financial assistance for the most vulnerable. The American people need help, and they need help now. In fact, there has never been a time in the modern history of this country when the American people were in more economic desperation and a time when people needed help. And if a government means anything, it means that we cannot turn our backs on tens of millions of families who today are suffering. So, Madam President, we have got to make sure that every working family in America, every working individual in America, receives at least $1,200 in direct payment. That is what we have got to do. We cannot continue the status quo of simply coming in here to work and then going home and going back on for our holiday. So, Madam President, I am going to do everything that I can to insist that we make sure that every working person in this country gets a $1,200 direct payment. And we're not going to go home until that happens. Madam President, thank you very much.
Sometimes I think that the people in this institution and in the White House are really losing contact and not knowing what's going on with the American people. In case you don't know, and you haven't seen the latest polls, the American people hold the President of the United States in contempt. They hold this institution in contempt. They hold the Republican Party in contempt. They hold the Democratic Party in contempt. They think that maybe, given all of the crises facing this country, it's about time that there was some bold leadership here and that this institution made some hard choices. And this is what the choice is about. We are spending $270 billion a year on the military, but we don't have a major enemy. I know it hurts your feelings. I know you're upset about it. I know you're hoping and praying that maybe we'll have another war. Maybe somebody will rise up. But it ain't happening. The Soviet Union doesn't exist. The Warsaw Pact is through. Who you worried about? Iraq? Panama? Who you worried about? I'll tell you who I'm worried about. I'm worried about the fact that our workers are seeing a decline in their standard of living. They want to see our industry be rebuilt. That's what they want to see. No more B-2 bombers, no more Star Wars. Let's make the quality products we need. Let's invest in American industry. No, I won't yield. The American people want to see our kids educated. They want a Head Start program. They want their kids to be able to go to college. They want to wipe out the fact that 5 million children in this country go to bed hungry. They want child care for their kids.
They want decent education. Let's have the guts to give some leadership to this country. The Cold War's over. Let's reinvest in America. Let's support this amendment.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from California.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much, Mr. Panetta, for yielding, and I want to congratulate you on the excellent work that you're doing on this fight. Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to Kyle Allen amendments, to the Barton-Townsend amendments, to the Gephardt-Bonnier amendment, to the Stenholm-Smith amendment, and to any other fraudulent so-called congressional balanced budget amendment, which is just another gimmick in our effort to deal with a very serious problem. Mr. Chairman, in the early 1980s, the Reagan-Bush team, corporate America, and some congressional Democrats came together to give us Reaganomics and the trickle-down theory. It was a fraud. The result of that effort is that the rich became richer, the working people and the poor people became poorer. That's what trickle-down theory was about. That was the early 1980s. Mr. Chairman, a few years later, they gave us deregulation. You remember that theory? Get the government off the backs of those S&L industry. Let them go out and reinvest in America. Mr. Chairman, that was another fraud. The result of that, the S&L industry turned out to be a bunch of thieves and crooks, many of them under indictment, and now the American taxpayers, the working people, the elderly, are bailing out those institutions to the tune of $500 billion. Well, Mr. Chairman, the same people who gave us Reaganomics and deregulation, they're back again. And what's the gimmick for this year? This year, it's a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. But wait a second. In the last 10 years, Reagan-Bush haven't once given us a balanced budget. In fact, over the many years, budget deficits have soared. We now have a $4 trillion national debt. Mr. Chairman, interestingly enough, during the last several years, the President of the United States and this Congress has had the opportunity to really deal with the deficit crisis. Let me give you an example. Last week on this floor, we had an opportunity to reduce military spending by $27 billion. No phony money here, no gimmicks, real money. You know what happened? We got 90 votes out of 435. All of the brave, most of the brave proponents of this constitutional amendment, they couldn't vote a 10% reduction in military spending. Mr. Chairman, over the last 2 years, we have dumped $105 billion of the S&L bailout into the deficit. Some of us said, no, that's wrong. Let's do it pay as you go. Let's ask the people responsible for the problem, the people who made money out of the S&L fiasco, to pay for it. Don't dump it into the deficit. Don't have the elderly and working people pay for it. Oh, no. The same proponents of the constitutional amendment, where were they then? Into the deficit it went. Mr. Chairman, in the last 10 years, we've given hundreds of billions of dollars in tax breaks to the richest people in this country. Their incomes have soared. Some of us have said, hey, let's ask the rich to pay more in taxes so we can deal with the deficit crisis. Where were the proponents of the constitutional amendment? They were there defending their wealthy friends. And on it goes. Now, let me tell you, and Mr. Panetta made this point, what's going to happen if this so-called balanced budget amendment passed? Where do you think they're going to get the money from? If they're not getting it from the rich, if they're not getting it from the defense, if they're not getting it from the S&L, I will tell you where they're going to get it. They're going to slash Social Security. They're going to slash Medicare. They're going to slash veterans programs. The same people who said, let's go out to war, they're going to slash those programs. They're going to slash federal aid to education. They're going to cut back on housing programs. I would ask for one more minute.
Gentleman is recognized for one additional minute.
Mr. Chairman, if this institution does not have the guts to take on the rich, does not have the guts to take on the military-industrial complex, is not prepared to deal with the S&L fiasco, I can assure you that it will be the working people, the poor, the elderly, the people who are already suffering, who will see serious and major cutbacks if this constitutional amendment is passed. Let's have the guts and say no to this gimmick, and then let's come back and do the right thing and deal with the deficit crisis in a fair and progressive manner. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman.
Chairman, let me, in all due respect, perhaps inject a moment of reality into this debate for the American people and talk about priorities, about where we want this nation to go and what we want our future to be. And I would suggest that those Americans who are observing this debate might be somewhat confused about the tone of the discussion. And let us, in the midst of this debate, talk about a Defense Department budget of $252 billion, plus another $22 billion more in other appropriations for the military. Mr. Chairman, let us remember reality. 5 million children are hungry today. 1 million children are sleeping out on the streets. Hundreds of thousands of children lack inoculations for diseases that should have been wiped out 20 years ago. Mr. Chairman, we rank first in the world in terms of childhood poverty. 20% of our children, highest in the world, are poor. Hundreds of thousands of bright young men and women today are unable to afford to go to college because the federal government does not provide adequate funding for higher education. And today, despite the fact that the Cold War is over, that the Soviet Union, let me remind you, I guess we forgot, it's been 2 weeks since Yeltsin was here. Long time. Guess what? Soviet Union doesn't exist. Warsaw Pact doesn't exist. Despite that, the Congress and the President today have the unmitigated chutzpah to vote $4 billion for B-2 bombers. That's what we're talking about today. In other words, Mr. Chairman, not enough money available to wipe out childhood hunger. No money available, but guess what? We got $4 billion for B-2 bombers. So that's what's going on, America. Mr. Chairman, whenever this country wants to go to war, we hear the patriotic speeches about the need for our young men and women to put on their uniforms, put their lives on the line. Guess what, Mr. Chairman? 2 years ago, the Congress and the President cut $3.5 billion for veterans programs. It is no secret that our VA hospitals are grossly underfunded. And today, this institution and the President have the gall to talk about $3.2 billion more for the absurd Star Wars programs. $3.5 billion cut from veterans programs, $3.2 billion available for Star Wars programs. That's what some of us call priorities. These priorities are wrong. Mr. Chairman, 2 years ago, this Congress and the President cut Medicare programs for the elderly by $43 billion. And, Mr. Chairman, it is no secret that the President, many members of this Congress, want to slash Medicare for the elderly even more. $43 billion cut for Medicare, but guess what? In this particular appropriations, we've got over $100 billion a year to defend Western Europe and Japan against a non-existent enemy. Some of us think those priorities are a little bit strange. Mr. Chairman, if you have read the latest newspapers, you will have noticed that the number of Americans who believe that the President of the United States is doing a good job is about 30%. 70% think he's not doing such a good job. Now, that's a pretty discouraging figure, except when you look at the United States Congress. This institution is below 20%. In other words, Mr. Chairman, maybe we might want to wake up and understand that the overwhelming majority of the people believe that the President and the Congress are way out of touch with the needs of ordinary Americans, and we need some fundamental changes in the priorities of this nation. Mr. Chairman, the American people are crying out for hope. They want quality education and a national health care system for all our people. They want decent paying jobs as we rebuild American industry and produce environmentally sound products. They want decent paying jobs as we rebuild our crumbling infrastructure and build a mass transportation system, decent bridges and decent roads. They want decent paying jobs as we put our carpenters and construction workers back to work building the millions of units of affordable housing this country desperately needs. Mr. Chairman, let us stand up today for a new set of priorities for America, and let us give hope back to millions of Americans who lost it. Let us vote no on B-2 bombers and yes for the kids, no on Star Wars and yes for the elderly and veterans, no on $274 billion for the military, and yes for millions of decent-paying jobs as we rebuild American industry and our crumbling infrastructure. Mr. Chairman, let us defeat this entire appropriations bill today and begin the process of developing a whole new set of national priorities so that once again, the American people can believe in their government.
Time of the gentleman has expired.
Thank you.
For what purpose the gentleman from...
Is recognized for 2 minutes and has permission to revise.
Mr. Speaker, why is campaign finance reform important? Is this some kind of esoteric intellectual debate, or does this in fact strike at the heart of American politics and is vitally important to every working person, every elderly person, every low-income person in America? Mr. Speaker, the United States today is one of 2 nations in the industrialized world that does not have a national health care system. That